30 minutes after 6 o'clock, and I was talking in the top of the show about June being, having some of the longest days in the year, and it's also the month of the summer solstice. Here in the Caribbean, it also marks the beginning of the hurricane season, and we always hear all these predictions for the season, but let's now look at that a little bit closer and look at disaster management and the national agenda. And we have with us this morning Mr. Robert Hayward, who is the Deputy Director Acting of the Department of Disaster Management. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you doing this morning?
Fine. How are you doing?
All right. So when the month of June comes around, does this signal something for the department, or is your job on all year, first of all?
It does. In effect, it does signal, as we all know, the start of the tropical weather system season, the hurricane season. However, over the past maybe 15 or so years, we've been practicing what we call comprehensive disaster management. And what that is, that looks at all hazards throughout the year, all levels of society. So we look at the hurricanes, not just the hurricanes, the tsunamis, the earthquakes, flooding, etc. So contrary to popular belief, we're not only active during the hurricane season. This morning in particular, I want to look at the national agenda, what we do at the Department of Emergency Management, and how the system operates generally in the context of Barbados.
So this is the national agenda in terms of disaster management overall?
Overall,
okay,
yes.
So what is on the agenda?
Well, let me start by saying, first of all, that emergency management in Barbados is a system. It includes a lot of entities and departments. And at the helm of that system is a unit, if you may call it a unit, called the Emergency Management Advisory Council. This council is made up of select members of Cabinet, the Minister of Home Affairs, as well as persons involved in the emergency services, the Commissioner of Police, Civil Service, Barbados Defense Force, etc. Now, this council looks after the disaster management agenda nationally. Out of this council, the council is created out of the Disaster Management Act 2006, Cap 20, and out of this council, there are 15 subcommittees. And in the subcommittees, there are particular agencies that have functional, if you will, functional, how should I say it? Responsibilities, that's correct. Functional responsibilities for disaster management. Entities like the Ministry of Agriculture that are responsible for feeding, the National Housing Corporation responsible for housing rehabilitation, and they're actively engaged in that after Tropical Storm Thomas. We have the Ministry of Education that is responsible for sheltering, etc. So there are 15 of those subcommittees. I know CBC is on one of the subcommittees. That's the Public Information Education Subcommittee, which is chaired by Government Information Services. So there are 15, as I said, 15 of those subcommittees, which they sort of execute the council's policies as relates to national disaster management. Now, coming out of those subcommittees, there are particular activities that we engage in. The department itself is formed under the Emergency Management Act, and our job is to essentially look after the government's national agenda.
Now, Mr. Hayward, you've done a really good job of explaining to us how the whole structure works, but by its very nature, a disaster is not a time in which most people keep cool heads. So help the average person understand, to whom do they go as their first port of call for help in a disaster when they feel like they cannot help themselves?
Well, first of all, by virtue of the definition of disaster, is when we've said to ourselves that, hey, we can no longer handle this situation, we need external assistance, whether it's at the local level or the national level. So if we start at the local level, if a community considers themselves to be undergoing a disaster, then the first person they should turn to, everything else being equal, is the community officers, the district emergency organizations.
And those people would have made themselves known to the community?
Yes,
it should be obvious who they are, where they can be found.
Yes, we have 30 district emergency organizations across Barbados, and they're really charged with the emergency agenda at the community level.
One of the things that I think would be a good thing to include here as well would be the importance of maybe families planning for things that could happen as well. How important is that, and how can families go about putting their emergency plan in place?
Well, certainly at this stage, we are almost 1 month into the hurricane season. And things that we should already have in place is, first of all, know your vulnerabilities. Know what can affect you. We all appreciate the hurricane hazard, but the hurricane hazard itself does not destroy a home. You may have wind damage, you may have water damage, you may have secondary hazards, could also be fires. So you need to understand, first of all, what you think you may be vulnerable to. What is it that keeps you awake at night? Once you've done that, then you want to look at how then do I mitigate that hazard. If my area is floods a lot, then there are certain things that the community may be looking at, like the clearing of wells, the constant clearing of gullies, clearing of drains, for example. One may even go as far as raising your home out of the level of the water and stuff like that. So there are things that we need to understand, first of all, with respect to understanding our vulnerabilities. What are we vulnerable to? What can most affect us?
Should we make family members responsible for doing certain things, though, as well?
Yes. Well, we always advocate preparing a family disaster plan. And within a family disaster plan, you would, for example, teach children how to call the emergency telephone numbers. You would teach them how to evacuate their home safely. And you can turn the lights off and have them run an evacuation drill and see how fast they can get out of the house without injuring themselves. You can do certain things like prepare a disaster supply kit. Flashlights, batteries, potable water, bottled water, prescription medicines for at least 3 weeks during the hurricane season, etc. You should also consider whether you would evacuate to a shelter during an event or before an event, or whether you will shelter in place or shelter at home. If you're going to shelter at home or you're going to shelter at an emergency shelter, then there are 2 types of emergency kits that you should prepare. The shelter at home kit would be one in which you can easily access it. Maybe you can store your stuff in the fridge, in the freezer, etc. But the kit that one would take to an emergency shelter would be one in which you can probably store your stuff in a plastic container, some bedding, flashlight batteries, foods, canned foods. Within an emergency shelter, you would not be fed until after the first 3 days.
Wow.
The national system is set up such that after the first few days, the Ministry of Agriculture would have their systems in place to feed the population. Now, bearing in mind that Barbados is a small nation, and the same people that we anticipate to assist us may also be impacted.
Right.
So we have to give them time to organize themselves, to mobilize themselves, to be able to assist us.
All right, you introduced an interesting area there with the role of the agencies. And we will discuss that when we come back after this break. And we'll also be taking your calls. So remember, you may call us at 226-5563 or 5562. There you go. We'll be right back.
Morning, Barbados. Good morning.